We're here today with Dr. Katie McGee. Thank you so much for your time, and yeah, uh, hope you can add value to all of us today.
That's the hope. Thanks for having me.
Great. So before we start talking about physical therapy and all you do, especially also in the esports industry, can you tell us about like your journey in how you got where you are?
Sure. So I started out by getting my undergraduate degree in exercise and sports science and neuroscience.
Mhm.
So I'm super interested in the brain body connection. I knew that I wanted to get into physical therapy. So that was kind of the pre degree program I did. I got my bachelor's in that, then went on to get my doctorate in physical therapy. Ended up with an accidental master's degree in the process. I picked up a master's in anatomy and in clinical health sciences, which is nice for a bit of a broader perspective on health as well. And while I was doing my last clinical rotation, which was in an inpatient brain injury unit, which was incredibly interesting, I started doing in-game stats for Dota 2. I worked at a couple tournaments. I did a whole bunch of remote online stuff because gaming, of course, it's remote and online. But when I was at tournaments, I'd see a lot of just really terrible ergonomics, and not necessarily the fault of the players, but if a tournament only has one size of chair available and that's supposed to fit your 16-year-old who's still growing and your 28-year-old who's like getting ready to be a parent, they're not necessarily going to fit comfortably into the same equipment. And so I would come home and I would complain about the terrible ergonomics that I saw. My friends got tired of me complaining, and they told me either to stop complaining or do something about it. So I went with the do something about it option. I started providing ergonomics guides, postural health guides to players and to teams, which is how I met my co-founder at 1HP, Matt. Originally, 1HP was just two physical therapists doing physical therapy stuff in esports. It's now expanded because we really like the holistic multidisciplinary approach. There's a lot of interconnectedness when it comes to health and performance. So now we have physical therapists, occupational therapists, athletic trainers, registered dietitians, clinical and sports psychologists, kind of all of that whole group involved in providing care to esports competitors at a whole variety of levels. We work with everybody from pro teams to individual casual weekend gamers, the folks who come home after a 9 to 5 and just want to play. We've been getting into the collegiate and high school spaces as well, which is fantastic. We're finally getting some like really good developmental structure there. And so we love being able to support that particular, the backfilling of growth and development that we haven't had in esports for a while. And if there's any chance to, make sure that those developmental steps include a bit more of a focus on holistic health and performance, and not just grind the game for 14 hours to get better, we'd love to be a part of that.
That's great. Amazing intro, by the way. And yeah, you mentioned it like ergonomics and everything. Like, what are the common injuries that you see in collegiate or in pro players that you also work with?
So a lot of what we see is postural related, and I'm using that kind of as a broad catch-all for anything involving neck, shoulders, upper back, lower back. Everybody thinks, gaming injuries are going to be in the hand and wrist, and there certainly are plenty of those, but we do see a lot of posture stuff. I'm using posture stuff is definitely the technical term for this. It's helpful to think of some injuries and some pain as not kind of a prescriptive, this is exactly what's going on and it's only bounded by these things. It's a lot more useful to think of them in the context of the whole body and how it functions together. So, having a chair that has a seat that is too deep might cause you to slump down, so you're not putting pressure on the backs of your knees. Slumping down causes you to put pressure on your low back. When your low back is rounded, you have to compensate with positions of your upper back and your neck. And those things all add up. So if I only treated where you're having the pain, which is your neck, because your neck's in a weird position, I wouldn't end up solving your problem. So instead, being able to look at that whole postural chain, the kinetic chain, we call it, enables us to actually fix what's going on. So we see a lot of posture stuff. And then, yes, we see plenty of upper extremity stuff. Most of the upper extremity injuries that we see are tendinopathies or injuries affecting a tendon. They're not necessarily a tendonitis. Itis means inflammation, and not all tendon injuries involve inflammation. Some of them involve a tendon that's been damaged and tried to repair, but repaired poorly. Tendons need a certain amount of load on them in order to heal properly. And if you're not putting enough load on them, if you're not putting them under appropriate amounts of strain, not excessive, appropriate, then you're going to end up with a weaker tendon, or a tendon that's still painful potentially. So we see a lot of tendon injuries, especially related to the hand extensors, things that make your hand go like this, and the finger flexors, things that make your fingers curl like this. Unsurprising, given a lot of the positions that your hand is in, if, say, you're on a mouse or holding a controller, or even on a keyboard. There we go. There's my hand in the frame. So those tendon injuries are the very common thing that we see in the upper extremity. And sometimes we'll see secondary to that, a nerve issue going on. But a lot of the nerve issues that we see, again, are kind of secondary to other things that are happening, and they aren't just happening in isolation.
That's great. And how do you like going more into the collegiate space? Like, how do you make sure administrators, like, how do you communicate to university administrators about all of this? Like before, like founding the esports program and everything, but before going beyond into more founding into other areas, like first, it's essential the health and well-being of the students. How do you make sure the administration sees that like the value that you provide, for them to focus that first, and then they can provide other things?
Yeah. So the really great thing about some esports programs, the really great thing about esports programs in college spaces is that most, if not all, colleges already have some sports architecture in place, right? They have the construct of each team has an athletic trainer who works with them and manages their care. Now, not all esports programs are under athletics departments, but even club sports in most colleges have access to athletic training staff, just maybe on a less regular basis than, a varsity team might. So most colleges already have something in place that could be used. So it's not as though they have to go out and reinvent the wheel. They've got something that could fit. That being said, a lot of athletic trainers don't necessarily have a whole lot of education in the kinds of injuries that you see in esports, which is part of why we made a continuing education platform to provide that kind of education to medical professionals and performance science professionals. Which the nice thing about that platform is those continuing education credits actually count towards licensure renewal for PTs and athletic trainers, which is great because we have to do that every 1 to 2 years and take a whole bunch of courses. But the fact that these colleges already have something in place that they can at least compare to or recognize, the analogy of, oh yeah, just like the football team has athletic trainers to deal with injuries when players get turf toe, sprain an ankle, tear an ACL. Our esports team can have access to athletic trainers when they develop wrist pain or tension headaches or, cubital tunnel syndrome, something going on in their elbow. So the concept is there. The part that generally requires a little bit more convincing is twofold. One is convincing the players that this is something that they have access to and should rely on, right? If you grew up playing sports, you probably grew up having access to some kind of medical professional care, and it was expected. If you had pain, you told your coach and you talked to your athletic trainer. That was a requirement of being a good teammate. You needed to be healthy in order to participate. That's not necessarily an expectation that you get in esports. And even worse, a lot of the times when you do hear about pain and injury as esports competitors, you're hearing about it in the context of someone whose pain was so bad they had to take time off or they had to retire. I'm thinking of Hacks. I'm thinking of High. There's plenty of players that we only hear about the pain they're having when they're leaving because they can't deal with the pain anymore and they didn't get enough help early on. So one of the hurdles is actually convincing players to make use of the care that's available to them. And of course, colleges don't want to make wasteful decisions. If esports teams aren't using the care that's available to them, then they're not going to make as much care available to them. It's a wasted resource. And then the other difficult thing is convincing administrators at times that this is an activity that requires potentially athletic training support or at least some kind of medical support. There's all that debate about whether or not is esports really a sport? Are esports competitors really athletes? Which, in my opinion, is a huge red herring. Whether or not esports is sports doesn't actually matter, except maybe for the purposes of classifying it for like scholarship options. What matters is that esports does have particular health and performance demands. There are particular biomechanical strains that are placed on the body while doing esports. And physical therapists, athletic trainers, occupational therapists, kinesiologists are all really well suited to address those particular strains. And the vast majority of injuries that we do see are preventable ones. Tendinopathies in particular are super duper preventable if your body is conditioned to take on a certain amount of strain or load. So it's a lot easier to get preventive care involved and a lot less expensive to get preventive care involved than it is to deal with the after effects. So when we talk to administrators, one of the things that colleges really like to hear is, how are we going to save money with this? So a lot of times what we'll talk to them about is the money saving or cost saving aspects of preventive care. And hey, esports is something that draws people to your college or university. Esports gets eyes on your university. Esports allows you to incorporate, an AV club or even an AV degree program, allows you to incorporate journalism programs, game design programs, health sciences programs. It allows for cross-disciplinary work, which is great for research purposes. Research purposes get you grant money, and making sure that your players are able to continue competing and continue doing exceptionally well is what allows you to keep having those eyes, to keep having that cross-disciplinary collaboration, and to keep getting that grant money. So if you want to make sure that that's still an option for you, then you need to make sure that the players are healthy, which means putting in a little bit of upfront cost to make sure that your program includes these health and performance aspects so that they can continue performing at a high level.
Yeah, and also students pay health insurance to the university.
Yes.
So the less they use the health insurance, the more benefits
Yes.
the university will get. So that's another one.
Yep.
And yeah, and at the end of the intro, you mentioned like an expression like 14 hours of play. But like, what is your ideal? I know it depends. There's like some video games that require like fewer hours than others to train. But like, what is your recommendation in actual
So
training?
I do have to give the very,
Review?
of course, the very PT answer is it depends. And I also
Yeah.
want to give the caveat of my background is in health and performance. I have absolutely worked with traditional sports and I'm very familiar with kind of like the research-based recommendations there. There's a lot less research into what's optimal in esports, in large part because one of the difficulties in esports performance research is determining what constitutes a change in performance. Like, how are we measuring performance? Is it wins, losses? Is it KD? That doesn't apply for every single game there is. Is it reaction time? Is it communication? So there's that particular hurdle. But when it comes to looking at what allows for optimal performance, we can use what exists in analogous research. So research in fields like chess, in air traffic control, sitting still for a long period of time doing a cognitively demanding task, in traditional sports, in music, musical performance. We can use some of the research from there to inform best practices in esports as we continue to build up esports performance research. What we've landed on is something like this. For most games, there's going to be diminishing returns after a certain amount of time. That certain amount of time is going to vary per game. It's also going to vary depending on what other things you're doing throughout your day. So if you are, say, a college student athlete and your sport of choice is Rocket League, you're going to have to factor in the amount of time and energy and cognition you expend on your primary goal of being in college, which is and ought to be, your academic pursuits. So you're going to spend a decent amount of time doing those things in a day. You're only going to have so much remaining time. So let's say, between the actual classes you're taking and the homework and assignments you have to complete, let's say 6 to 8 hours of your day is already dedicated to academic pursuits, right? You've probably got, let's budget an hour, 2 hours in there for the amount of time you spent eating. Let's budget optimistically 8 hours for sleeping. That's optimistic. I too was a college student. Don't ask me about my all-nighters. But you've only got so much time left to actually fit your practice in. How do you make the most of that practice time? If you just grind esports, grind Rocket League for 6 hours, that's not actually super effective. What's a lot more effective is something like 2 to 4 hours of intentional, deliberate practice in which you set goals ahead of time, work on specific things, and as you complete chunks of practice or playtime, you review how close you were to meeting your goals, or whether your goals need to change. Some of that time is probably going to be spent scrimmaging with your team, and it ought to be spent scrimmaging with your team, because part of practicing isn't just your individual mechanical skill, but also how you function within the context of a team. So probably not more than, if you're a college student athlete, honestly, 4 hours is probably the upper end of what's going to be valuable, especially considering that you're also going to spend some time doing VOD review, or potentially doing some amount of, hopefully doing some amount of physical activity to help your, injury prevention, or your overall performance. One of the things that we know about cognitive performance is that consistent aerobic exercise actually does increase cognition. Even about as short as 7 minutes can result in up to 2 hours of increased BDNF production. BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factors. They're basically a learning protein. It makes your brain learn faster. So an overall structure of practice could look something like a short bout of exercise, maybe with your team, a kind of time where you are planning and setting your goals for your practice session, 2 to 4 hours of actual practice time, maybe an hour of VOD review. And then during that practice session, during that 2 to 4 hour chunk, it needs to not just be 2 to 4 straight hours. It needs to be broken up. One of the things that we do know about esports performance, this is one of the solid bits of research we have, taking a break at about the 45 minutes to an hour mark, and during that break, going for a 6-minute walk improves performance when you come back. This is compared to if you sat there and did nothing for your 6-minute break, or you scrolled Twitter on your 6-minute break and just looked at the absolute dumpster fire that Twitter currently is. Your performance actually worsens. I don't know whether that's because Twitter is a dumpster fire or because you're just sitting there doing nothing, but a 6-minute walk does boost performance. So your practice has to be deliberate and structured, in the same way that, you're not going to get the most out of a soccer practice if you're just spending 3 hours scrimmaging, as opposed to 15 minutes doing an aerobic warm-up, followed by 5 minutes of dynamic stretching, followed by, half an hour of small ball skills, followed by an hour of drills, followed by half an hour of scrimmaging. Breaking it up that way is a lot more valuable than just play.
Mm-hmm. And how do you work? Like, you've covered a lot of stuff, but like with sleep, how do you work with students and esport programs? Because when we are doing placement of students with these programs, we find out that most esport programs have like unlimited access to their facilities. Like 24/7. Like
Yep.
They can go all night, all day. Some have some certain time frames, but like,
Yeah.
how do you make the esport director or the head coaches, the benefits of,
Yeah.
not all the nighters, and how do you also transmit that to the students, the importance
So
of sleep?
a lot of it is education. And in the same way that we can't force student athletes of traditional sports to get a certain amount of sleep per night, we absolutely can't support esports athletes to get a certain amount of sleep per night. The best and most important thing we can do is education and what I call experiential learning, which might also be known as the you learn it by messing up kind of way. If you don't get enough sleep, you're going to feel it. And that's probably sometimes the best way to learn, like dealing with the consequences of your choices. But we do a lot of education for players. And one of the biggest things we educate them on is it's a lot less important what time you sleep and a lot more important that it's consistent. So sleeping from like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. probably isn't going to work for most players. Sure as heck doesn't work for me. But sleeping from like 1 a.m. to 9 a.m., well, if you don't have any 8 a.m. classes, that's perfectly functional. As long as you're consistently going to bed and waking up at about the same time, plus or minus about half an hour or so. That's the thing that's most important for higher quality sleep. And at that age range, at the collegiate age range, you're going to be needing between 7 to 9 hours on average. Some people will need a little more, some people will need a little less, but you want to be hitting somewhere in that window. So a lot of what we start out with is let's educate people on the things that they are actually likely to implement. Things like a consistent sleep-wake time, things like having a routine before going to bed and on waking up. Doesn't matter so much what the routine is, as long as there is one and it is consistent. And maybe if we're feeling ambitious, maybe doing a little bit of sleep tracking. And that could be, using a fitness device like a watch. It could be just writing it down in a journal. Here's the time I went to bed. Here's the time I woke up. The important part for coaches is they're often the people that their players trust the most. They're the ones that the players see on a day-to-day basis. They have that rapport with them. And so the coaches have to also buy into this education and be reinforcing it as well. So the education sessions also always involve the coach. And then last but not least, one of the things that we found works really well for getting people to engage in good sleep behaviors is competition. We worked with a team who had this, it was called the Ready Band. It was made by Fatigue Science. It basically tracks how well you recovered based on your sleep. And we had a leaderboard for them of who had the highest recovery score, who had the best sleep readiness. And it turns out a whole bunch of, very competitive esports folks also get competitive about who's sleeping the best. And there are some ways to game the system, but not too many. And so between the fact that the players noticed, oh, wait, I'm not yawning half an hour through VOD review anymore, and the fact that they could see on a board an actual metric of how they were doing, that was kind of some healthy, literally, competition. That doesn't work for every team. Some people get stressed out by the metrics, and it's fine to not use them for everyone. They're not perfect. They're not a be-all, end-all. But it's good to have options. And the most important thing is just making that education available and enabling student athletes to make those healthy choices by letting them deal with the consequences when they make unhealthy choices.
That's great. And one thing that really stuck to me that I was not aware of is the having. I mean, I know about the consistent sleep schedule, but I didn't know that if you didn't do the go to 10 p.m., wake up at 6 a.m. or to bed at 1 a.m. or wake up at 9 a.m. The important is not when you go to sleep or wake up, it's having the consistent
Yeah,
sleep
and
schedule. That is
and
something.
don't get me wrong, there are absolutely, there are some times that it's harder to do. Like if you are a third shift worker and you are sleeping during the day, even if you're getting consistent sleep wake times, you are going to have more drowsiness issues, more fatigue issues. You're not going to sleep quite as well, unless you're someone who has a really weird circadian rhythm. And your circadian rhythm, your overall activity level throughout the day is going to play a role in how well you're sleeping during that hopefully consistent sleep-wake time. But to boil it down to something really basic that most folks can implement, it matters less what time specifically you're going to sleep, matters more that it's consistent.
That's great. Caitlin, super interesting. Just to wrap this up, how do you see healthy esports in, let's say, in the collegiate scene in the next 5 years? You think
Oh gosh.
there needs to be some consultancy to actual physical therapists, for sports physical therapists to go into esports, or do you think depending on the funding that the school may have, having a physical therapist, especially for esports, do you think physical therapists in traditional sports can guide
Absolutely.
esports players?
I think pretty much anyone who works in physical medicine and rehabilitation can learn about how to do esports healthcare performance well. That's part of why we developed the continuing education course, because we know there's lots of really highly qualified medical professionals out there who want to get into esports, but don't necessarily know, what do I need to know about biomechanics, and what are the most common injuries and how do I deal with them, and what are some of the cultural considerations of gaming and esports that I don't know about yet. That's a big part of why we made a continuing education course. But my dream would be that all colleges with esports program have an athletic trainer attached to the team, the same way that traditional sports have an athletic trainer attached to the team. I'd also really love if coaches weren't just game specific coaches, but they also had someone whose focus is on health and performance. We see in traditional sports that coaches aren't just teaching players how to play the game. They're also responsible for promoting overall team cohesion, team communication, developing strategy. And so I think that teams should have a performance coach attached who is involved in those more less game, more performance aspects. I think it's most sustainable if it's in-house at each school. As a stopgap, certainly like, hello, we exist and we're happy to be the stopgap measure, but we'd love to make sure that what's happening is colleges are getting professionals who are trained to work with their specific institution, who are local to that area, who know that team, who support that school, because in the long term, that's what's going to work.
That's great. Dr. McGee, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, we're staying in touch. By the way, is there any where people can find you?
Sure.
Social media?
It might still be a dumpster fire, but I am on Twitter at Kate McGee PT. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. And if folks want to shoot me an email anytime, it's just my name, Caitlin McGee PT at 1-hp.org. If you guys want to check out any of the work that we do with pro teams or with continuing education stuff, our website for players is 1-hp.org. We offer telemedicine. We offer educational content. We offer consulting with registered dietitians and fitness professionals. And then our continuing education platform is EHPI, Esports Health and Performance Institute.org.
Hey, Lynn, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.